there's still this huge fiscal crisis in the American budget. And frankly, we have a similar one on a smaller scale playing out here in Australia. Is it possible now, for democracies like the United States, like Australia, that are facing huge fiscal imbalances, that have huge demands for social services, with all of the guardrails in place, with all the politics that are involved? Is there a way out, do you think, for countries like the United States to ever get back on a fiscal path? Or is there some cliff that the U.S. is heading for that no personality, no Musk, no Trump, and certainly no major party can cope with?
Well, there has to be a way out because, as you say, the cliff option. If you're heading down from a high place, down from a mountain, you've got two choices. One is to take a steep decline, traversing around the bends and twists and managing that carefully, or going over the edge. Only one typically ends up with you surviving at the end of it. So, they've got to find a way down from this extraordinary debt mountain that they have. Yeah, there are ways to do it, James, but they're politically painful, right? They either have to raise taxes, which nobody ever wants to do, or they have to cut spending, which Republicans are supposed to want to do. But we're seeing increasingly, especially this new Republican Party, which is a party that is appealing more and more to working class voters, to voters who rely on things like Social Security and Medicare. Many, many more of those voters are voting Republican now than than they did when they used to vote Democrat. So you've got a party that has got a vested interest in keeping taxes low, and also increasingly got a vested interest in keeping spending high. That is a recipe, obviously, for massive fiscal chaos. And they've got to get to grips with that. And so far, they're not doing it. There are ways to do it. You could, the US says, I don't need to get into the details, but the US does have a very expensive pension system, Social Security, which is generous, much more generous, actually, and people don't often know this, much more generous than most Western countries have. Those changes could be made. Not everybody, the Goldman Sachs investment banker doesn't need to receive the same amount of Social Security payments as the person who's been unemployed for the last 10 years. So there are ways in which these can be addressed. Same with Medicare or Medicaid spending. It will be painful, but it needs to be done because, and this is a very important point, James, I just want to make, drive home. And I know it's the same in Australia too. The more the deficit goes up, the more the deficit continues, the debt goes up, the more the government is paying every year in debt interest costs, in debt service costs. And those debt service costs alone will be eating up the bulk of the government's revenue. The United States is in a position in the next few years where the largest single entry in its book, in its spending book, will be debt interest. It won't be defense spending. It won't be Social Security or Medicare or any of those things. It will be the amount it's paying in interest on the debt that it's on the money that it's borrowed over the previous period. So that is not sustainable. That is where you get into what people talk about as a death spiral, a kind of vicious circle where you have to keep borrowing more and more and more money just to pay the interest on the debt that you already have.
Look, it's a huge crisis. We both know it. And, touch Social Security at your peril. That's what I've been told for decades in the United States. But, Gerard, before I let you go, I want to ask, too, there was an extraordinary piece in your newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, this week about Harvard. And it said that it had educated so many people from the Chinese Communist Party that they called it the party school, not in the sense of a party with, party school with lots of beer and parties and all that, but the Communist Party. And you have said, you've written a great piece where you say that even though you're a big critic of Trump on a lot of things, when it comes to higher education and Harvard, bring it on. Bring on this fight with Harvard and clean up the mess that's going on there. Tell us a little bit more about what has been happening at Harvard, particularly that's made it so corrupted by CCP influence and everything else.
Well, a number of things. James, as you know, all universities in the West, I know it's true in Australia, it's true in the UK, it's certainly true in the United States, of these elite universities have become captured in the last 30 years by this progressive left who control all of the major faculties, all of the institutions, crucially who can control the administration. They practice affirmative action policies, discriminating against people of certain races because they don't fit the ideological agenda of these people. They ban people from speaking at these universities. They teach only a monocultural left-wing progressive ideology. They indoctrinate students with this stuff. It's got worse and worse and worse for 30 years. And it has major, major implications for the way in which the country develops, the way in which our culture develops. And I'm sorry to say, look, I don't like any government interfering with education, with private institutions. But in the end, hard terrible situation like we have in American education does require hard measures, and that's why in the end I think Trump is actually right on this.
Gerard Baker, we're going to have to leave it there. I think you're absolutely right. Read his stuff, everybody, in the Wall Street Journal.